Welcome to the webinar, Introduction to SmartView Reporting. This webinar assumes that you know what an Essbase database is, how it is structured, and what dimensions and members are. It also assumes that you don't know what SmartView is. Hereafter, throughout the presentation, SmartView will be abbreviated to SV. References to the older spreadsheet add-in in the presentation are abbreviated to the letters AI. The objectives of this webinar are for you to understand what SmartView is, connect to an Essbase database using SmartView, use the core commands in SmartView to create ad hoc reports, and export live data from an Essbase report in Excel to Microsoft Word and PowerPoint. What is SmartView? It's the new Oracle Hyperion Universal User Interface into things like Essbase, planning, financial management, interactive reporting, and so on. This webinar is limited to SmartView and its interaction with Essbase. And from an Essbase perspective, SmartView is pretty much like the old Essbase spreadsheet add-in, but with more functionality and greater reach. SmartView was introduced in version 7 of Essbase, but at that time it had limited functionality, and it interacted with fewer products and did not import data into the Microsoft products. At that time, it was also an extra cost feature, and for those reasons, it had a limited customer adoption. As stated earlier, SmartView was developed as a single user interface into many of the Hyperion Oracle products. It also allows for exporting of data from SmartView reports into Microsoft Word, PowerPoint, and Outlook documents. And there are other functions that give it access to financial management and Essbase that are available in Word, PowerPoint, and Outlook, which are not part of this webinar. So that's why it was developed. Why should you be interested now? Because SmartView becomes bundled with System 9 and version 11. It does have a greater functionality than it did in version 7, and it is Oracle's product of the future as opposed to the older spreadsheet add-in, meaning that's where future development will go in. This webinar uses SmartView version 11. Just like any Windows product, SmartView has a menu and a toolbar. And if you're using Excel 2007, it also has a Hyperion ribbon. In the menu, you'll notice commands like Data Source Manager at the top. If you're working with SmartView 9, however, Data Source Manager was at that time called Connection Manager. Once again, I'm using version 11. And then the core commands that I talked about earlier are under a menu called Ad Hoc Analysis, which contains a submenu containing commands like Zoom In, Zoom Out, Pivot, Keep Only, and Remove Only. Those are the ones I consider the core commands. And then down here further on the menu, there's a refresh command also, which we'll be using frequently. The toolbar has access to all these commands, and the toolbar is much nicer than the old add-in toolbar in that the icons are much more descriptive of the function they're performing, and when you hover over them, the descriptions are quite clear. I'll show you how to connect to SmartView to Essbase using both SmartView 9 and SmartView 11. The first, SmartView 9, had something called the Connection Manager as the top command in the menu. And when you selected that command, it opened up the Connection Manager window. In the Connection Manager window is a list of all connections that you can possibly make, whether it's to an Essbase database, an HFM data source, whatever. These connections are provided to you by the administrator, and you select a connection, press the Connect button in that window, and then you provide your username and password to that connection within the Connect to Data Source window. Press the Connect button there. That brings you back to the Connection Manager, from which you can connect to a second connection if you'd like. As many connections as you want, make connections to, and those connections you can then use in any sheet within any workbook that you'd like. In SmartView 11, you'll use the Hyperion Data Source Manager command, which you can access from the menu or via the toolbar, the far left button, Data Source Manager. That opens up the Data Source Manager window on the right-hand side, and it provides a link called Connect to Provider Services, which you must press first. Once you do that, that then opens up a set of 3 possible types of connections you can make, different data source types. The one we're interested in this class is Oracle Essbase. So I'll click the plus sign next to it. It then shows me a list of all of my possible Essbase servers I could connect to. When I click the plus sign next to it, it will usually at that time ask you for the user ID and password for that server. I've already signed on once today, so it's not asking me at this time. And once you've provided your username and password, it displays a list of Essbase applications. An application is a folder that holds one or many databases. I'll select the sample application, click the plus sign next to it. It presents me with a list of all of the databases within that application. I select the one that I want, called Basic, right-click on it, and then press Ad Hoc Analysis from the pop-up menu. At that time, it goes out to the server, to that database, and presents the initial SmartView report. In SmartView 11, without the Data Source Manager and without having the command called Ad Hoc Analysis, when you connect to a database, your next command is refresh, which is the same as the initial Ad Hoc Analysis command in SmartView 11. So make sure you press refresh after connecting to an Essbase database in SmartView 11, and in both cases you will receive the same initial report. And the initial report contains the first dimension from that database in the rows area, the second dimension from that database in the columns area, and all of the rest of the dimensions in that database. This database happens to have 5 dimensions, so there are 3 remaining dimensions in what is called the Point of View toolbar. For those of you familiar with the older spreadsheet add-in, you might notice that the initial report looks very similar in the add-in as it does in SmartView, with one important difference. The add-in presents all of the dimensions in the database, with the first dimension being displayed as a row dimension, year in this case, row 2, and all of the other dimensions as column headers in columns B, C, D, and E. Whereas SmartView takes that same report, presents the first dimension as a row, row 2, and the second dimension as a column, column B, and then all of the other dimensions in what is called the Point of View toolbar. We'll talk more about the row, column, and point of view dimensions coming up.